Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to go through a comprehensive guide on Orfist Masques. At the time of this recording, Orfist Masques is one of the best decks in the format. And you know, with the introduction of set 13, it is still a very viable competitive deck. So going to go through everything about the deck builds, some of the alternative choices that you can make for this deck, as well as an explanation on kind of how to play the deck in its entirety, as well as how this deck goes into the current metagame, and obviously looking forward to the set 13 meta as well. If you guys need any coaching, my link is in the bottom right hand corner for my Metafy. Feel free to book a session and we can get started. If you guys haven't done it already, click that subscribe button to get all the notifications on new videos coming out on this channel. So big shout out to Joshua Lee, one of my fellow Malaysian brothers, for giving me this list that he ran for Singapore. I decided to give him a little bit of a tribute. So I love Joshua Lee, everyone loves Joshua Lee, and this list is probably as stock standard as it gets. The deck log code is 7EX8. I will post it in the description as well, just to kind of give you guys an idea of what the structure kind of looks like, and I guess going forward, you know, how to kind of build the deck. So just going to go through this deck list and I guess talk about some alternatives as well along the way. But yeah, this is probably as, you know, how should I say, cookie cutter as it can get. And yeah, I'll just explain some of the choices that I could potentially make in the deck list as well. So just looking at the ride line, so we run the full Orfist ride line. So starting with the grade 0, grade 1 rides to search for a world. This is a must, you must run the grade 1. Now the grade 2 slot is quite flexible. So there is an alternative for this, but I think the reason why you would want to run Kubisia is so that it's a 15k attacker. Your opponent can't just 15k no pass it on a grade 2 turn. So the idea of this deck is to get your opponent at high damage, and then once they get to high damage, then obviously your grade 3 turns onwards will be a bit more aggressive. And then playing Orfist Regus as the main grade 3, it's just really good. The fact that you can just place and then put a world from your hand or your drop onto the into the auto zone and just essentially proc any of the abilities. But the second skill, not so much. Although the second skill is good, especially if you get stuck on Regus, which sometimes is the case. You know, sometimes you don't get the mass, sometimes you don't get the massive Hydrogam, and you just can't jump to Orfist Masques. So staying on this is okay, because then, you know, you count loss 1, discard 1, and then for every 2 worlds in your auto zone, then you call 1 Shadow Army token. So you're still attacking for 4 times a turn. So the alternative to Kubisia would be Combine Rusher. Combine Rusher is a good, you know, set and order, counterblast 1, call it out for free, and then it becomes a 20k attacker on the rear guard. The only problem with that is it uses counterblast, and this deck is actually quite heavy on counterblast because it uses for your grade 2, which searches out for the mask, as well as your grade 1, which essentially uses it is used as a foolish barrier. And for those who don't know what that is, it pretty much searches your deck for a world and put it into the discard pile, or the drop zone in this case, right? So this deck actually uses quite a bit of counterblast. So using Combine Rusher as, I guess, another source of counterblast may be a little bit tricky, especially if your whole deck revolves around, well, most of the deck revolves around counterblast. So I think the idea with Kubisia is better, because then you're aggressively putting on pressure on turn 2. Then, you know, you're attacking 15-15 or, you know, maybe 18-15. Then you're putting the pressure on your opponent, and then your opponent kind of has to guard, right? So yeah, you know, if your Vanguard attacking 15, they can't just 15k no pass, and if you whip a crit, then it's actually detrimental for them for the rest of the game, because the tempo is then in your favor. So yeah, that is the ride line. Then the next, obviously the star of the show, is Orfist Masques. This card is pretty bonkers. Can only be written from a grade 3 with Orfist, which is, you know, the idea of all the masks. And if you remove an Orfist from your hand, soul, or drop, you can choose one of your world cards from your drop zone and put it into the auto zone. The good thing about this effect is that it can proc all of your worlds without paying the cost. So for example, if you put Eclipse Moonlight into the auto zone using this effect, it will proc this skill. Because when the card is placed in the auto zone, then you can call a Shadow Army token to the rearguard circle. In the same light, You can also put Hollowing Moonlit Night into the auto zone and draw 1 card. So yeah, like the synergy with this in your world is really good. But not only that, but the last skill is when it attacks, you can cast 1 and put any number of worlds from your auto zone into the drop, and then call Shadow Army tokens based on how many you put into the drop. And if you put 2 or more, then this unit gets +1 drive. So usually the idea is you put 2 into the bin, this gains +1 drive, that's the minimum, right? Then you call 2 Shadow Army tokens to the front, and that's already 5 attacks, yeah? There are cards as well that I guess synergizes with this, and we'll get onto that soon, so keep that in mind. But that skill in its own package is really strong to just generate free 5 attacks with very minimal commitment from your hand, essentially. And even if you have to commit from your hand a world, it's a dead card in your hand, so you don't feel bad about playing the world cards from your hand. So just looking at the next set of stuff, so we play 4 of the Dragon Tree Wretch Cyber Kaitul. So similar to all the other nations, essentially when you place this on rearguard, card +1, sword +1, generate a Dragon Tree marker, and then search for your Mask of Hydrogram from your deck and add it to your hand. So starting hand, you kind of want this as well as Orfist Masques, very similar to Greedon when I explained that one. You want Skull Kemda and Greedon Masque in your hand. So in similar ways, you kind of want this and Orfist Masques in your hand as well. A must play 4 for maximum consistency in this deck. Then the next card that I think this is available in the Orfist supply set is Polar Axis Dragon, and this card is pretty crazy. So when it's placed on rearguard, if you have an Orfist Vanguard, sword +1, choose a world from your drop that I guess is different from any of the worlds in your auto zone at the moment, then you put it into the auto zone. So automatically this procs all your Eclipse Moonlight and your Moonlit Night, and then pretty much you draw or create a Shadow Army token. So in itself, this card committed is a +2 to the board, which is pretty crazy. And why I mean +2 is because of its second skill. So when this card is put into the drop zone from rearguard or hand during the battle phase, and if you're Dark Knight or Abyssal Dark Knight, so 1 or 2 worlds in your auto zone, then you may draw a card. So when this card is overplaced by Orfist Masques skill, calling out Shadow Army token, you immediately draw 1. So by playing this, you sword +1, you set an order, so you either get an extra Shadow Army token or an extra card in your hand, and then when a Shadow Army token overplaces this card, then you get 1 more card in your hand as well. The best thing about this is that it keeps the board stable, you have presence on the board, and all your Shadow Army tokens are like grade 1s anyways. So again, something like Gandiva where it multi-selects different grades, your board is never going to be like that. So yeah, this is a very, very strong card, one of the staples in this deck, a 4 of, a must play 4. I think this card is really insane for the deck. Then the next card, obviously not a max 4 of, is Opart. So this card is when it's placed on rearguard, if you have a Vanguard with Orfist, you can card +1, search your deck for a world, and then put it into the discard pile or discard it, and then shuffle your deck. So this sets up your drop zone, so that when you ride into Orfist Masques, then you can start setting it. If you play your Polar Axis Dragon, then you can start setting it from your discard pile. Very, very strong card, and then not to only, I guess, play as a commitment. If this unit is retired, if you have an Orfist Vanguard or Orfist Masque Vanguard, then you may call a Shadow Army token. So essentially, if this overplaces itself, then, well, if it's overplaced by a Shadow Army token, then it creates a Shadow Army token, which makes that your 5 attacks become actually stronger. So when you start discarding 3 from your auto zone for Orfist Masques skill, if you're replacing this, then you're actually creating 4 Shadow Army tokens instead of 3. So yeah, that's, I guess, a combo that you can kind of do, but we'll explain that a little bit later in the video. Then just like every other deck, so you play 3 Violate Dragon and 1 Elementaria. I think in this particular deck, this is as it goes, because it's not reliant on cards having, I guess, the unit trait or being a unit card. So you have access to Elementaria in comparison to something like Greedon, where unit cards actually matter, because if this card is in your hand, you can't actually play it down on a rear guard, so that Greedon sucks it up. So this deck is not so much reliant on the PGs being unit cards. So yeah, you play a 3-1 split, you play 8 crits, 3 fronts, 1 Brandt Gate OT, the best OT in the game, and then 4 15k heals. If the meta calls for it, maybe now, where there's a lot of restanding Vanguards, then you might want to play the restand heal. Previously, there might have been a case for crit heals, but I don't think crit heals are too relevant in this current metagame. I think restanding heals are much more impactful because of Bastion, Minerva. Those are the 2 that really come to mind, right? Other things like, you know, Overlord sometimes. There's other restanding decks out there. But yeah, restand heals are probably the most, I guess, impactful for this current metagame at the moment. Then looking at the orders, so you play 2 masks. This deck only plays 2 masks because you're reliant on your Cyber Kaitel. You can increase it to 3 if you like, but then you're eating up into your worlds. And I think it's really important to have 8 worlds. So you play 2 of the Overcoming and Eternity, which makes all of your Shadow Army tokens really beefy. So all of your Shadow Army tokens that are placed, those placed units gain plus 5k. So if you have multiple of these, they gain plus 10. Which is really, really impactful in standard, because the power scaling is pretty ridiculous with this deck. As well as the fact that, you know, you put that on top of Persona Ride, and just the base 15 as a Shadow Army token, very, very strong. Then 2 Eclipse Moonlight, you don't need to max this out because your ride line actually searches either this or your Hollow Moonlit Night. So this card actually is searched off your grade 1, which means that you can play this on turn 2, count +1, core a Shadow Army token, and then you put like, I don't know, a Polar Axis Dragon or like a Kaitel in front, and that's already a 25k, and then your middle is a 15, so very, very strong combo on your turn 2. Then you play 4 Hollowing Moonlit Night, pretty easy order to kind of play, I guess. If you place this from hand, it trades itself for an extra card, I guess a draw 1, right? So this card doesn't actually become a dead card in your hand. Generally, what you want to discard is your Overcoming an Eternity and your Eclipse Moonlight once you start ditching for, you know, your rides. But as well, you know, you might as well keep the Hollowing Moonlit Night in your hand to kind of trade for 1-for-1, right? A dead card for maybe a semi-useful card. So yeah, that's pretty much the deck. There are decks that run the 1 retire order, so if you do want to run that, you drop the Hollowing Moonlit Night by 1 and you play the retire order yeah, as a one-off, because it's searchable using your ride line. So when you ride up to grade 1, you can find it, but very rarely do you ever find the instance where you need it. But I guess, you know, against pesky stuff, then you can kind of set it in the order zone, discard it off Orfist Masques, then the next turn ride Orfist Masques, get rid of like Regus or something, or you play your Polar Axis Dragon, you put that into the order zone, start retiring stuff. So yeah, that's, I guess, the other alternative for this deck. So just kind of looking at this deck in retrospective of the current metagame at the moment. So the decks to beat are Minerva, Bastion, Accord, and then obviously looking forward, you'll be looking at, you know, beating Youthberg, Leonorn, Jadul, Ignis. Those are the 3 decks that kind of come in mind. Next year will be, you know, Token Rambu, if that is still relevant. And then, you know, even in the current metagame, you kind of still have to beat Greedon. The best thing about this deck is that, you know, if you roll to go first, you're pretty much ahead already. And the offense with this deck is actually pretty insane. A lot of the cards in here seem like kind of dead cards, right? You're playing like what, 8, 10 orders, and they seem kind of dead. But the thing is that this order here is 4 copies of any other card in the deck. What I mean by that is when you play it, you can still boss 1, draw a card, and the card that you draw can potentially be another copy. Well, the card that you draw is one of the cards that this card can represent, right? So you're actually only playing 6 dead cards, which is not too bad, right? A lot of your stuff is then searched out by Rotus as well, so you're actually playing 5 dead cards, right? 5 dead cards, one of them being Massive Hydrogram. And the thing is that when you play this, if you find, you know, Kaito or your Orfist Masques, then it's actually not a dead card at all. So the value of shield you actually get in this deck is actually quite big, right? Because if you're playing Polar Axis Dragon, you're setting your Eclipse Moonlight, then what you're actually getting is board presence, right? Then you're committing less from hand to create a board, which is what you want, right? Then, you know, Orfist Masques then places Shadow Army tokens, and you know, you can just kind of roll with that on the next turn if your opponent doesn't get rid of it, right? So actually the hand commitment in this deck is actually very minimal. And you know, you get to a stage where you're triple driving. If you check heals, then it's good for you because you're healing one. That means that you're actually committing less cards again to kind of guard. So naturally this deck actually generates a lot of hand advantage as well. So yeah, that's pretty much the deck. Kind of looking at the metagame though, this deck actually is pretty neck and neck with Greedon. I've played this deck multiple times into Greedon, and sometimes it becomes like kind of like a trade who can heal more. But I guess then again, you know, Greedon will always be up in damage, but this deck actually just tears Greedon's hand apart because it hits ridiculous numbers. In the same token, this deck kind of goes the same into Accord, Bastion Accord. But Bastion Accord, the difference is that they generate a lot of, like, I guess, drive checks, similar to like Greedon, and sometimes they can just like trigger sack you out of the game, but that's pretty much with every deck, right? One of the harder decks I think with this deck is actually Minerva, and that's purely because of multi-attack. So with this deck, as aggressive as it can be, you kind of have to pace yourself at times where you give Minerva enough CB so that you can survive and then you kill them on the next turn, because the offense of this deck is actually really strong. So yeah, that's kind of the three that comes to mind. Then obviously looking at, you know, Full Blast, Vivace, Jejuled Ignis, this deck probably isn't as power scaled as they are, so those decks are naturally stronger than this deck, but not to say that this deck can't just like roll you, you know, create a bunch of Shadow Army tokens that just whack in the face and win, right? This deck still generates a lot of hand, but may or may not can or can't keep up with, I guess, how much Youthberg or how much Jejuled Ignis will just, I guess, power creep this deck out, right? So yeah, that's kind of the retrospective of this deck into the metagame at the moment. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to switch to CFA and kind of explain to you guys how this deck kind of operates, thinkings to kind of mulligan, and kind of how to set up the board, right? So I'm going to start with my grade 0 and draw my 5. So starting this, right, what you really want to see is a card that you can discard, which is a world, right? And so far, 2 worlds in my hand, that's really good. You obviously want to mull your triggers. That's kind of with every deck. And then you also want your mask, right? And your mask being either Kaito or the mask itself, right? So if you think about this hand is actually pretty good because your right line search is 1. You're going to discard 1 for grade 2. So essentially you're going to get 2 in the bin and set 1, right? You set 1 on grade 2 turn, and then you ditch 1, well, you ditch 2 by the time you get up to grade 3. Perfect number, right? Because once you ditch 2 in the bin somehow before you get to grade 3, then your Polar Axis Dragon actually sets up. So in your hand, you want to kind of have 1, you know, in best case scenario, you have 2 in this case. But yeah, 1 world, 1 Orfist Masque, and the Master Hydrogram itself, or Kaito. So I'm going to draw 2. Unfortunately, we didn't get the mask, but you know, alas, that's okay. So let's just say we start the turn, so we draw 1. Polar Axis Dragon is great, right? That can be, I guess, played a little bit later on, but you know, now we kind of select what we want to ditch. Now, if we want to play aggressive, then we want to keep the Moonlit, the Eclipse Moonlight in hand so that we can rush our opponent. But in this case, there's actually not a lot of, I guess, things that we can do with this hand. But I guess, you know, if you're playing Orfist Masques, then you kind of want to push the aggression as well. So maybe something that we could do is probably dish the Eclipse Moonlight, and then you get a +1 off Moonlit Night, and then kind of go like that, right? So let's ditch Eclipse Moonlight, ride Rotus, and then Rotus skill. We search for a world. So here you kind of want to search your Eternity, because Eternity, then you can use that Eternity to discard, and you set the Moonlit Night to draw one, right? So we're going to add this to hand, shuffle deck, and let's just say, you know, at this point, your opponent is going to be like, okay, well, give you 1 damage. But because we ditched the Eclipse Moonlight, we kind of don't want to take damage because our hand is like not well versed to kind of rush. And you're only probably going to be hitting for 1 light anyway, so we're going to go 15 for no break. But in the instance where we do want that counterblast, then, you know, you take 1 and then you rush your opponent. But I think in standard, this is probably one of the most important guards of the game. So just ditching a 15k for essentially no pass unless your opponent hits an OT, then it's pretty good, right? So let's just say we got 15, we stand and draw, we ditch the Eternity. So now we have 2 worlds in the bin. That's what you want, right? So we ride Cubisia, then we set the Moonlit Night, so +1, draw 1. Okay, we got Kaito. Kaito's pretty good for the next turn. And then obviously you give 5k to your Vanguard, call it a day, right? 15k means your opponent just can't throw a 15 for no pass, and then you check 1, front looks pretty good, you're up 1 damage, right? Next turn, let's just say your opponent rushes you 1, so let's just take 1. And then here you can kind of debate whether you want to take 1 or not. Taking 2 means that if you jump to Orfist Masques, which you can because you have access to the mask as well as Orfist Masques, then you can, I guess, play a bit more aggressive against them, right? So let's just take 1 more. All right, cool. And then it's our turn, stand and draw. So here, this is like where you kind of have to be a little bit creative. So you obviously want to play Polar Access Dragon because we have Eclipse Moonlight in the bin. So that will create 2 cards on the board, right? In the same token, you also have Cyber Kaito, which will find your mask. So that's an L position, right? So you have one side being a solo unit and a 1 field column. So here, Polar Access Dragon is actually not great, right? But you have to kind of look a turn ahead, right? Turn ahead because you're going to be discarding 2 off the Orfist Masques in terms of the world, so you kind of need to recoup that, right? So here, let's ditch a heal, ride Orfist Regus, and Orfist Regus' skill searches for an order or a world in your discard pile or your drop zone, and then put it into the order zone. So you want to put Eternity here because then all your future tokens that you generate gain +5, right? Cool. So we got that, and let's play Cyber Kaito, counterblast 1. So we always want to counterblast the world, and then soul blast 1, and then we create a dragon tree marker. And then here, this is where you kind of have to choose where to put it, because when you ride to Orfist Masques, then the unit on your dragon tree marker gains +5. So you actually want to keep it away from the Cyber Kaito, because when you overplace the Polar Access Dragon, you draw 1, and then that 1 singular Shadow Army token gains +5 off the Dragon Tree marker, as well as Overcoming Eternity. So you search your mask, add it to hand, and then you play the mask. So you obviously search for top 5 for a mask. Pretty good. Now we have a Persona Ride for next turn. Optimal, right? And then you ride this by putting the mask in. Cool. So now we don't need to use Orfist Masques skill to remove Orfist from your soul. You want to wait for the next turn, because the reality is you already have 2 that you can discard, and you kind of keep the Eternity in there, right? So let's play Polar Access Dragon. So here you can Soul Blast 1, so you Soul Blast the Regus so that it's in the bin. So you can use the Regus to remove it on the next turn. So you Soul Blast 1, set a world from your discard pile or your drop zone into the order zone, and because this is placed, then you create 1 token and you place it behind here. Because this is on a Dragon Tree marker, then this gains +5. So notice how all your numbers are like 20 and 25. Really, really strong. And now, once your Vanguard attacks, it has triple drive as well, okay? So in terms of attacks, this is pretty good for a turn 3 You don't need to kind of overextend. There's nothing really in your hand to overextend with anyways. So let's just say, you know, you're attacking 20. Actually, in this case, because you're discarding 2, you actually want to attack with the front 2 first, and then overplace them with Shadow Army tokens. So you attack 10, then 20, then 13. So Orfist Masques skill will then cast 1 and then discard any number of worlds. So you want to discard your Eclipse Moonlight and your Moonlit Heal, then Moonlit Night, sorry, and then you create 2 Shadow Army tokens. So let's create 2 here. Once, well, I should probably set 2, create 2, and then you overplace these. So you overplace 1, you overplace Polar Axis. Polar Axis' skill will allow me to draw 1, and then Shadow Army tokens gain +5. This actually gains +5 from the turn before. I mean, sorry, from the placement before because of the Eternity. So each of these now become like 40 and 25. Ridiculous numbers, right? Okay, so 13 with triple drive, so you check 1. Crit, looking pretty good. You know, if your opponent, you know, puts 15k for 2 pass, then you might look at putting onto the Vanguard. As a turn 3, it actually is pretty good to put onto the Vanguard because your opponent's at 10k. This is a 20k shield, which is 2 cards from hand, right? And in terms of efficient guarding, 15k to the middle, 2 to pass, and you check 1 crit at the start is like pretty good. And I guess in hindsight, well, actually not in hindsight, in this perspective, we only see 2 triggers out, right? So putting onto the Vanguard, the likelihood of you hitting 2 triggers is pretty good. Alternatively, you can actually put it onto the rear guard and make it a 30k shield instead, which makes it really hard for your opponent to guard. Let's just say, you know, your opponent's hand is like 4 cards. They're a combo deck, kind of need the hand. So let's just put it onto rear guard, gain crit. Second check, front, looking pretty good. So if you put it onto the Vanguard, you would have broken through with a crit. And then third check, cool. If that third one was a trigger, then lucky me, then it goes through, right? Then this is 45, 50, right? This is on turn 3, actually ridiculous, right? So let's just say, you know, you end your turn, your opponent's a 5 attack deck. Let's just say you're versing against Willista, right? So guard for 5k first. You kind of want to keep the Kai tool to create another Dragon Tree marker, but also to deck thin 1 if you don't see the mask. But, you know, let's just say, yeah, we don't really need it. We have a Polar Axis Dragon. Everything's kind of big anyways. So we'll go with 5. The other, and then your Vanguard attacks is like, what, 50 something, no guard, take 1. And then your other 2 sides attack. So it's like one side is like, let's just say 30k. So you go with 20, and then you eat the other one, right? Okay, cool. So stand and draw. You Persona Ride, draw 1. Okay, so now we need 2 orders in the drop zone, into the order zone, right? From our discard pile. So you Polar Axis Dragon, Soul Blast 1. You want to Soul Blast the mask. Sometimes you ride Regis and then Persona Ride into it again, which, you know, sometimes can come up, but very rarely does it do. So you Soul Blast 1 and then you set Eclipse Moonlight skill, then you can Counterblast 1. Oh, and no Counterblast to create a token, place it behind the Vanguard. That column's pretty big, right? Then let's just say, you know, we remove from play the Orfist Regis, then you play this to draw 1, right? Now we can play from hand our other one. So we can play the Moonlit Night to Soul Blast 1 and draw 1. And now our hand is actually pretty stacked, right? So now we can actually discard 3. So if you want to discard 3, you obviously want to attack with an L shape first, and then, you know, give your opponent the rest later. The Dragon Tree marker gives +5, so that's what, 25 already, looking pretty good. All right, so battle phase, let's just say we attack with 25. Oh, so actually all of these tokens that just came out there gain power because of the Eternity, right? So we go 25, 40, yeah, so 40, and then this is 43, ridiculous numbers, right? Counterblast 1, let's discard 1, 2, 3. So once you discard 3, then you obviously create you know, a couple of Shadow Army tokens. So we obviously create 3, put that back into our hands. So we replace 1, replacing 2, and then replacing 3. The Polar Axis Dragon allows us to draw 1, and then each of the Shadow Army tokens gain +5 because of the Eternity, right? And we also have Triple Drive. So this is a 55 column, 45 column. Ridiculous, right? Ridiculous power. So you check 1, check 2, crit. So let's just put it on this side, gains crit, and then the Eternity, right? So as you can see, the hand is actually healthy because very minimal commitment onto the board just by playing 1 card, right? Naturally, you just create, you know, Shadow Army tokens, your Polar Axis Dragon refunds itself, and, you know, by playing Polar Axis Dragon, you soul boss 1, put like a world in, and then create another token behind your Vanguard, the board creates itself. So yeah, that's pretty much how, I guess, simulated you can kind of play Orfist Masques. Obviously, there are other little nitty-gritty stuff that you can kind of play. You know, in terms of sequencing, it's actually pretty important to note that Eternity is a card that you want to set first to ensure that all your other Shadow Army tokens coming after, I don't know, gets the benefit of the +5k. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. Just jumping back to the deck list here. If you guys want to check out the deck list, I Love Joshua Lee 7EX8. I'll put it in the description as well. If you guys like this video, pop a like, comment down below what you guys think of Orfist Masques. Have you guys played the deck? Do you guys enjoy it? This is probably one of the decks that I kind of have to sit around and kind of think about the deck in its entirety and kind of figure it out myself, because the first time playing this deck, I kind of didn't know how to like sequence things, but as you know, you kind of play the deck out, then you can kind of understand how everything kind of synergizes. If you guys haven't already, click that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in the next video.